The aim of this meeting is to get new perspectives on the tactic and strategic choices of the Swedish XR branch, but hopefully the discussions will be useful for you who are from outside Sweden as well. We even have some guests from Norway, I think, so a special welcome to you. And my name is Ragnhild Larsson, and as co-hosts we have Paula Richter. Maybe you can say hi.
Hey.
And also Jonas Olsson.
Hey, hey.
And we are, of course, very happy to have Özden Berglund and James Özden with us tonight. So a special, very special welcome to you. We are very happy that you could make it. And Özden Berglund does research on civil disobedience and social movements at the University of Bristol. And his current research explores climate change activism and especially Extinction Rebellion and the use of civil disobedience. And James Özden is the founder and director of the organization Social Change Lab that does research about social movement to help solve the world's most pressing problems. And James has spent the last 3 years building effective social movements to tackle climate change and to reduce animal suffering. From working on strategy for Extinction Rebellion, he has learned valuable lessons in designing effective movements. So we are really looking forward to your input in this meeting. I would like you to start presenting, Özden.
Of course. So, can you see my presentation? Yes, good, cool. So these are obviously questions that me and James think about a bit. Why, when, and how direct action or civil disobedience works. So I'll try to answer that from my perspective, and then maybe towards the end kind of differentiate my own perspective on this that might be a little bit different from James's. So first of all, why do we, or you specifically, disobey the law and do direct action? And that's obviously, as you well know, I mean, a big reason is to get media attention to an issue or to a group. And I think that's an important distinction because you often focus on the issues. The current climate movement focuses on the issues and do not necessarily seek to gain popularity as a group. And that's obviously a distinction that James and I often make when in discussions about what effects do the kind of protests that we do have. But one thing obviously that is really important to think about is to what purpose do we get media attention? And there you will know that you have to do, when you do engage in certain kind of protests, you have to justify that in a lot of different ways. And depending on what the protest is, you might have to justify it more. This media attention also has opens the door for other actors to come in and get space in the media, such as me or James, that often get asked in and interviewed about these kind of protests. And that obviously creates a space for us to raise the kind of issues that we want to talk about as well. So the kind of duty to make use of the media space that is open for this does not just lie with the activists themselves, but also lies with all the different kind of actors in society that get that space in the media. And then, of course, when this kind of strategy or tactic rather was kind of launched by Extinction Rebellion, and particularly by Roger Hallam, that I'll come back to a few years ago, this issue of sort of creating tension in society, using polarization to kind of create a debate and get people to join the movements and to come closer, to care more. Also will push other people away from the movement, and that's fine, right? That's part of the thinking behind it, and I think that's important when you look at how people react to these activist groups. So when you say that people turn against it, it's often the people that you know are going to be pushed away, the kind of sectors of society that will not like the actions or the causes for which you fight. What this polarization then means, and this tension means, is of course that issues get politicized. So that's the aim, and I think obviously something like Insulate Britain or Återställ våtmarkerna are precisely aimed at making an issue, bringing it into the political sphere, and getting it up the agenda, and making it forcing a position, right? And that's obviously what that kind of thinking was part of what I call kind of Halamism, of forcing a position, of forcing people and politicians to take a position on certain issues. Now, one really historically and across societies, one really big reason to engage in civil disobedience and direct action specifically is that it can get direct results, and it has much better track record of getting direct results than any other form of protest. But it doesn't mean that it's always successful, of course. But we can think about, under what circumstances does it get those direct results? And then it is often about the type of demand that is asked for. So if you have a demand that only the national government can put into place, then obviously that's much less likely to be a direct outcome of your direct action. So then what you can hope for is kind of the media attention, or the politicization of an issue, but that you're unlikely to see what's it called? I don't know what market is called in English, but you're unlikely to see that as a direct result of the protests themselves. And that's different from if you have a local demand, a demand that can be enacted by the actor that you're kind of trying to influence. So, for example, we can see within the broader climate movement, we can the divestment movement, for example, we have seen direct effects, right? So we have seen when students have occupied universities and so on with the demand of divestment, that has sometimes been successful. And of course, in the sort of anti-extractivist movements, we also see that sometimes these movements are successful in stopping extractions, and that's true across the world. So then also the target matters. So if you're going to get these direct results, the target matters a lot. And we can see, obviously, a lot of the questions that were sent to us beforehand had to do with targets and what kind of targets make sense and so on. Now, there aren't necessarily any that I would say absolutely wrong targets. And I think that we should be really careful in listening to the critics of these tactics, and when they say, don't target the general public, don't do this. You can't say that it's always wrong to target the general public, but yourselves that you have to do a lot more justification if you do target the general public than if you target the actors that are problem. And of course, if you target the actors that are the problem, you don't just rely on the media attention. It's not then just about the attention that you get, like you actually you kind of achieve something politically by targeting your enemies, so that it doesn't all come down to the kind of media attention that you get from it. And then one thing that I think that the targets talk about is the targets say something about your politics and about what you think are the driving forces about in climate change and in doing something about climate change. And that's somewhere where certainly in the UK you've seen a lot of movement towards having targets, and particularly with Extinction Rebellion, that when they say we quit, what they said was we quit from targeting the general public. They're not quitting with targeting powerful actors in society, and their actions did shift long before they said we quit, to actually target kind of actors that are involved in what they call the kind of climate change status quo and maintaining things as they are. We'll get back to that more in a minute. So that's kind of what broadly about when and how, or to what purpose we can use direct action. Then when this was brought up, and obviously I've been I've been somebody who's been quite critical of what I call kind of Hallemism and Roger Hallam, which has been, and he has been a really influential figure in a lot of thinking about this, and in a lot of these movements, not just Extinction Rebellion, but of course then also Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil. And he has been clearly wrong about a lot of things, right? So like one of the main things is that if we get the state to repress us, that will then, which he's been very successful at getting the state to repress us, then people will get angry and more people will take to the streets and more people will engage in these kind of protests. That, by and large, isn't really happening. I mean, James, for example, has shown in his research that, what is it, like 10, 15% of population basically said that they would be up for participating in some kind of direct action for climate change. But of course, the actual numbers are, very, very low. And in terms of numbers, the actual direct action movements have never achieved the kind of numbers that Extinction Rebellion did when they had 6,000 people in the centre of London in April 2019. So that's one thing that he's been wrong about. And then he's also been, he made these very strong claims about what is the role of civil disobedience and direct action as this kind of silver bullet of like, this is what we need to do to save the world. And I suppose I'm a little bit more cautious about that. I say there is definitely a place for civil disobedience and direct action, so much so that that's what I dedicate most of my time to studying. But it's not it's not going to solve all our problems. It's not going to save us on its own. And then one of the things that I've sort of critiqued in Hallemism is also this focus on arrest, which seemed quite like he kind of plucked some aspects of the US civil rights movement to claim that it was that getting arrested was this like thing that what really made the difference. And I think anybody who has participated in civil disobedience or direct action will know that arrests is a real risk of doing it, but that doesn't make it aim. And obviously, the relationship to the police and to the courts is something that has changed and developed in the life of these movements, often to the better, where people are much more suspicious against the police, and at the beginning, activists were very bad at using the courtroom as a site for activism itself, and that has changed. But people do that more now. But we have, of course, seen a huge authoritarian backlash, and in a way, Hallam kind of predicted or wanted that backlash. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for us, and some of you are paying very heavy prices and will be paying very heavy prices for that authoritarian backlash, with activists being criminalized around the world. And one thing that Hallam was critiqued for very heavily from a lot of other kind of left-wing activists when Extinction Rebellion emerged was that this isn't actually a very good way of building broad movements. And there you kind of see that, well, I think that critique is correct, right? It's not very, this kind of deep, in a way, depoliticized, de-ideologized way of organizing and focusing on very high risk and radical tactics, but not backed up with a particularly radical politics, hasn't been very good at building broad movements. And some of the questions that you posted beforehand, I think, get to that. So just last couple of slides, but I mean, to me, any tactics or strategy in any political struggle has to start with, what are we up against? What stands in the way of action on climate change? And I had a session with a group of students during our strike here. We are on strike at the moment in universities in the UK, in a teach out, and where I asked this question: what stands in the way? And then the answers that come up is some kind of some capitalism, and then you break that up a bit and you say, well, it's the need for growth, this kind of property rights, and what companies can do with their property, and they focus on profit, and so if those are kind of structural things that stand in the way of action on climate change, then the actors that stand in the way are often obviously private actors, not least in the fossil fuel industry, but also in sort of accompanying industries such as the financial sector and so on, and also state actors. Often, of course, as climate activists, very directly that the police stand in your way of getting what you want, and underlying this a kind of culture that is kind of consumerist, individualized, depoliticized culture, where people have a quite narrow view of what is politically possible. And also, heavily consumerist culture. Now, if that's what the kind of enemy is, then anything that we do that can weaken the actors or the structures that we're up against is kind of worthwhile. And another point to make there is that it's not necessarily public opinion as we often measure it that matters. And I think that the kind of research that I increasingly am getting involved in, and that James also does, I think we're running the risk, and I think this touches on some of the questions that were posed to us, that just because it's measurable doesn't mean that it's the most important thing to do. What is the exact effect of a given, immediate exact effect of a given protest isn't necessarily that big. And I think actually some of James's research shows that the effect of a lot of protests on public opinion even is very marginal. But yeah, maybe we can talk a bit more about that later. And then I suppose final words, but not final. I understand that I will be given final words later in the talk. But what my final words would be, because this is an audience made up of a lot of activists who spend a lot of time and take and often great personal risk doing what you want, in your political activism, is that this search for what is right, what is the right course of action, is really context dependent, and that we should be really, of course we should learn from each other and from each other's countries, but what is right in one political context isn't necessarily right in every political context. And in specifically in Sweden now, you are in a specific political context where you've just had, you look at party politics, you've just had a general election that went very badly, and you've got a lot of far right politics in government. And there's 3.5 years until the next general election. So I think that brings a responsibility for you as activists in that context. Okay, so what is the right thing for us to do? What kind of actors should we try to sway, and should we try to put pressure on? And what kind of alliances can we build in this context that might be different from the context that other people are in other countries? And then a step away from this kind of Hallemism, then it's also you are political actors, so you shouldn't pretend that you're not political actors, and that part of that has to be to analyze the political context that you're acting in planning your actions, and that's often something that I missing. That Extinction Rebellion certainly did the thing that left, and I think just stop oil as well. That leaves very little room for that kind of political discussions and in setting out the strategy. But as closing words, doing something is almost always better than doing nothing. And don't let people tell you otherwise. That whether it's from a commentary or editorial in Dagens Nyheter or wherever it is, people will always tell you. I read the most ridiculous editorial in Dagens Nyheter the other day that told about the right way of doing protest from somebody who I imagine had never been involved in doing any kind of protest. So yeah, don't listen to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oscar. I read that article as well in the DN. It was really frustrating. But yeah, and obviously there are a lot of people having a lot of opinions who never do anything themselves. So, well, thank you very much. I imagine you have a lot of questions now to Oscar, but you will have to wait a bit more because first we will listen to James. So the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I will share my slides. Can everyone see the slides fine? Right. Yes. Cool. I will speak about something, I guess, much more narrow in a way than what Oscar was speaking about. And that's specifically about some research we did looking at this idea of the radical flank effect that I'll explain in a second, using some public opinion surveys that we conducted for some campaigns that Just Stop Oil ran, both in April and October last year. And just maybe some quick background based on what Oscar was saying. Yeah, I think we measure public opinion because, like you mentioned, it's easy to measure, but by no means that mean it's like the most important thing or the only thing or anything like that. There's like many important outcomes you might want as a group that takes direct action, or like on this diagram, whether it's shifting voting behavior, like building the number of activists who take part with you, policy change, corporate behavior, changing narratives. So there's like loads of things that are important. So like, I guess this public opinion research is just like the tip of the iceberg of like all the important things. So it's useful to keep that in mind, and you have to weigh up. Sometimes you lose some and you win some in terms of different outcomes. So that's, yeah, just useful context, I think, to not get overly obsessed with public opinion, even though obviously I think it is important. Cool. And maybe I'll just start with, I think, probably a decision or like a challenge that most of us face. Certainly I did when I was much more involved with XR, in terms of like, how do you design a campaign? How do you design an action? To what level should you be moderate or radical? Who should you target? And I think some considerations, so all these graphs are made up, so they're not peer-reviewed science, but I think it's useful to paint a picture. So for example, you might do like a moderate protest. So you can, and maybe in the UK, be like central London, you're not really disrupting anyone, but it's nice enough. You talk about climate change and the right issues, it's all good, but no one ever sees it, so it's like fairly small impact. And then the alternative is you do something a bit more radical, whether you do something disruptive, whether that's targeting oil companies, depots, art galleries, whatever you want. And people like your action less. They still like it a little bit, or like it still updates their thinking. Like is the wrong word, I think, like Oscar was saying. It changes their mind on some issues or makes them want to take action in some ways. And many, many more people see it, such that the kind of overall, at least public opinion impacts of this action looks better, like on paper. Obviously, this is a very simplistic model, but I think it's useful to kind of have this kind of conceptualization. But then it gets a bit tricky because there's this thing's called activist dilemma, basically. Should you be moderate or extreme? And there's pros and cons, like you can see. And I think there's some like clear negatives if you go like too far, so to speak. And it's obvious that I think some actions will have negative consequences. So for example, UK Canning Town, I don't know many people who support this as being like, this actually helped our movement achieve its goals of like furthering climate policy or whatever. So obviously we want to avoid those, but it's not clear what that line is from when it goes from like good to bad. And that line feels kind of important if like maybe millions and millions of people actually see what's happening. But obviously, obviously the pros and cons of the media attention, you get much more media if you do something radical and much less if you don't, and so on and so forth. And an example of this is, as an academic paper, if you wanted like academic proof of this, that basically they find that extreme protests against Trump actually increased support for Trump. And this is done in like a experimental condition, so it's not like the real world, but I think it's still useful. I think it paints a picture. So like knowing this is like, how should we think about our actions? And this is like, if you put that same logic into my pictures from before, if you think action is like just a little bit useful, then it looks amazing because it's all positive. If you think it's a little bit negative, it looks really bad. And I think this is one of the reasons why people kind of get so angry on social media and disagree of so much, because if you have like a relatively small difference in like what you think of the individual action, like the soup throwing that Just Oil did on the Van Gogh painting, it actually has a huge impact on what you think the overall outcome of this particular protest or campaign was. And this is another graph I made up. So the point is, yeah, like it's unclear when things go from being good to being bad. And I think this is a subjective judgment that we kind of have to, in some ways, experiment and like find out for ourselves and have an idea of what are the things we care about. Like, do we care more about getting more people to join our groups and take action with us? Do we care more about winning people over? Do we care more about getting alliances with certain groups? It depends on what you care about, but I think you can kind of at least frame it this way. And then, so going on to the actual polling that we did. So the first polling we did was in April 2022. So this is the first major Just Stop Oil protests. And they, as you can see, they blocked oil depots in the southeast of London, southeast of England for roughly about 2 weeks. And we did 3 polls kind of before the campaign started because we knew it was happening, during and afterwards. And we asked a bunch of questions asking about support for their demands. So no new fossil fuel. We asked about concern for climate change. We asked about how content people were with the government's action on climate change, as well as how likely they are to do something about climate change. We asked a few different measures of that. But you can kind of see, so one thing we found, which I think was something we hear a lot, is, oh, you'll actually put people off if you do things that are disruptive. And so we didn't find any evidence for this. So amongst everything we measured, nothing got worse as a result of the campaign. So we found no drop in public support for the policies or concern with climate change, which I think is obviously good because we don't want to make our lives any harder. So this was like somewhat reassuring and like some good evidence to show people, I think, if they make this claim. And we found one thing that did go up by a fairly small amount, like what Oscar was saying, these things are like, I don't know, it takes a lot to move people's public opinion. So even if you can find a little bit, I think that's still kind of actually impressive, or like it's kind of rare. So what we found was people said they were more likely to take part in some forms of climate activism after the protest. And specifically, they said they were more likely to attend a legal climate protest, talk to their friends and family about climate change, and lobby their elected officials like MPs about climate issues. But we didn't find any change for take civil disobedience. So that actually stayed the same, which I think is, so like almost people see the radical thing, they're like, maybe this is cool, but a bit too much for me. I'll do like the slightly more moderate stuff. And that's kind of like one explanation of what we found. But like I was saying, even if you find like fairly small percentage changes, like 2.6 percentage points, that's equivalent to 1.7 million people saying they will do something, which sounds a lot bigger. Obviously, like Oscar says, like 10% people said they would do it, but clearly not 10% are actually doing something. So that there's still a big gap between what people say and what they actually do. So it's useful to keep that in mind as well. But anyway, and this idea that I'll talk about in a second is basically called the radical flank effect. And in a nutshell, it's just, so a group, let's say Just Stop Oil does radical things, and actually, even though Just Stop Oil gets liked less, it increases support for more moderate groups. Maybe in this case, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, so on and so forth. And this is something that kind of has been found previously. If you look at the civil rights movement, there was kind of like Martin Luther King and like SNCC, or like the young student activists who are doing quite radical stuff, and the NAACP, who's a much more like moderate civil rights group. And they're going to have this similar dynamic where they actually kind of grew in both funding and membership and power as the rise of the more like direct action groups kind of came about. And there's been some academic work on this that has found it to be the case in like a controlled experiment. But I think experiments are useful a little bit, but really you want to see if it's happens in the real world. I think that's what we care about the most. So basically we copied this experiment that found the radical flank effect did exist for like a controlled condition for both a climate movement example and animal advocacy movement example. And we basically copied the same questions and ran it for the Just Stop Oil campaign in November 2022. So just like not long, like 5 months ago. And this is the one where they block the gantries and block the M25. And for context, the M25 is basically sacred in the UK. If you disrupt it, people will be so angry and so annoyed. It's like the Queen. You just can't talk about it in a bad way. So this is like quite a big deal. And also, in many ways, it was like a protest you'd expect to like not be successful, like go down badly. It was like a very small number of people, highly disruptive and focused purely on the public with like not really clear logic of why it was related to fossil fuels. So in many ways, like if anything is expected to like hurt public opinion, I think it's something somewhat like this, if it's within the non-violent realm. Yeah, anyway, and similar kind of thing, we did kind of this time we did 2 polls with the same people again before and after the campaign with like a few days apart. And this time we're asking slightly different questions. We're asking, so we use Friends of the Earth as our like moderate group. And we basically said, to what extent do you feel like you support Friends of the Earth and you identify with Friends of the Earth activists to kind of understand this radical flank effect in practice for like a UK context. And also we have support for climate policies, in this case, just oil policies. But interesting thing is, well, like something that attests to the media success of Just Stop Oil for this kind of action is like, yeah, over 90% of people said they'd heard of Just Stop Oil at the survey, which is huge, right? Like 90% of a country, this is representative. I think it's like quite a significant feat. I think most of this is probably due to the soup throwing actions, because even at the before survey, it was like 88%. So a significant number of people had heard of them. So I guess that's one positive. And yeah, this was more than Friends of the Earth by a large amount. And Friends of the Earth is like, as you're going to see, one of the most well-known charities, at least in the UK, and they've been around for a long time. And Just Stop Oil still outperforms them on like brand awareness, which is not necessarily an important thing, but it's still relevant. Cool. I want to the actual outcome stuff. So we did actually find that increased awareness of Just Stop Oil's campaign meant people supported they identified with Friends of the Earth more. And I think identification is an important thing because this is often used as like a precursor for actually getting involved with activism. Because obviously, if you don't feel like a group, you don't want to join the group and you want to take any actions with the groups. That's why I think it's a relevant thing, because it's like a building block for actually taking part. So anyway, as you kind of see this graph, it's obviously a fairly small effect, but it is, yeah, significant in a scientific way. And yeah, any kind of the more people knew about the campaign, the more this increased. So I think this is an interesting finding. And we found basically the same thing for support for Friends of the Earth. Very similar kind of shaped graph. Basically, the more people knew about Just Stop Oil's campaign after the protests, the more they supported Friends of the Earth, which is cool. And then to make like a bit of a simpler graph to put things into perspective. So before to after, we found a 3.3 percentage point difference of the UK population. That's roughly 2 million people said they supported Friends of the Earth goals more after the protest. So again, a good chunk. And as you can see on the graph, there's like this gray bit, which is neutral, which basically is the thing that mainly disappears. That goes down by like roughly 3 percentage points. And then the other stuff increases. So that you can kind of see the neutral space kind of gets smaller, and then everything else will help the positives grow, which is kind of how it works. But I think interestingly, we found no impact on support for JSO's demands or kind of basically ending fossil fuels, which I think is an interesting thing, because you think if people support Friends of the Earth goals more and the goals are about fossil fuels, it also increase, but not necessarily. And if anything, there was like a weak negative trend, but that wasn't like significant. So basically, there's like, yeah, I guess it's like basically it's quite hard to shift public opinion as it is, and I think also it's already quite high in places like probably the UK and Sweden. Is that lots of people already support these policies, so it's like pushing them up even a few bit more is actually quite hard. So we found basically no positive impacts on this one, it's neutral, and then also some potential polarization. So basically, people who had very high climate concern had like the same, like no really effect on their policy supports. But people who supported climate like not at all, basically like very little at the beginning, actually supported climate policies less the more they knew about Just Stop Oil. So basically, it's like you kind of say it's roughly putting people off who are already like not inclined, like climate skeptics, whatever you want to call people like that. So I think this is an interesting, example of how tactics can actually polarize. And like, that's one of the question of whether you think this is good or not. I think polarization can be useful or it can not, depending on the context. So this is like not definitely bad. It's just, this is an observation and make of that what you will. Yeah. Oh, and we're actually doing some more research. So I'm excited about this. In that we're actually doing an experiment between a Stanford academic lab and Just Stop Oil. We're actually designing like RCT, like a randomized control trial. We're actually going to test different kinds of protests that Just Stop Oil have done. So particularly targeting like emitters, art galleries, the public and government buildings, and seeing the different public opinion impacts of these kind of protests. So like actually like testing this target question in a bit more of a scientifically controlled way. So I think that's interesting. This will be like at least a few months though. So it's not going to offer you immediate guidance. I'm sorry, but I think this is interesting in the works. And another random thing we're working on is we're trying to do this like basically this survey of maybe 50 to 100 social movement academics who research protests and social movements, and asking them a bunch of questions, kind of like your ones, is knowing like who to target, when, to what degree you should use like disruptive tactics early versus late in like your issue's life cycle. So these kind of complicate things that it's hard to answer really empirically. I don't know if it'll be super informative, but I think it's interesting. And yeah, maybe we'll do some more stuff for JSO in April or May, whenever they do their actions. But yeah, all this stuff is actually on our website. All of our research reports are there, so you can go look at all the polling stuff is there. So feel free to use it. And if you have any questions, you can also reach out to me by email, or my colleague Marcus, who did most of the analysis. He's the data guy. So yeah, and that's it from me.
Thank you very much, James.